Welcome to the ThinkData Podcast, and today I'm joined by Ro. He is the Global Head of Business Development at Pi Health. They are a really interesting business. They're effectively an AI platform that's rethinking and reshaping how clinical trials are run. We're going to really dig into how Pi is moving beyond the traditional CRO model, how they're making trials more diverse and inclusive, and what they look for in their partners. We're also going to take a dig and closer look at why real-time regulatory grade data is so critical and what's next for Pi and the team. Yeah, Ro, thanks so much for coming on this afternoon. I appreciate you taking time out of your week. And I suppose what I'd like to start with first and foremost, for people that have not heard of Pi and may not have come across you previously, can you summarize your background? Because I know you've worked for some large players, you've also worked for smaller organizations, but who are you and what drew you to Pi in the first place?
Sure. So very, very nice to meet you, Alex. And
Perfect.
great to join the podcast. Yeah. So my background's quite interesting, actually. So predominantly I've been in business development roles for probably the past 16, 17 years. But my background, so I'm an Aussie. I grew up in Australia, did my undergrad in Melbourne Uni, and then moved to Cambridge in the UK to do a PhD in oncology and a postdoc. And that's where I've been for the past 25, 26 years in the UK. I've worked in science policy. I worked in a small consultancy, did an MBA at the Judge Business School in Cambridge. And then I've been in industry for the past 16, 17 years, predominantly in business development roles. So I've worked in really small biotechs. I worked in large pharma. So I was at AstraZeneca for nearly 5 years. That was quite cool because I was in the oncology business development team. It was very, very flat. So this is when AZ was rebuilding its oncology pipeline. And obviously, they're probably the world leading oncology company, actually, in terms of the assets and stuff. So it was a very, very cool time to join and to be there because it was pretty flat, a very flat organizational structure. So I had quite a lot of responsibility. Did, I think, 12 or 13 deals at AZ, including the 𝐬𝐻 collaboration, which is a drug that's really changed standard of care. And then after that, I went to a small biotech in London where I was VP and head of business development there, and then joined 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐻, which is where Pi was incubated about, nearly 4 or 5 years ago now. So the background there was basically when I was at AstraZeneca, I worked quite closely with the now CEO of Pi Health, a guy called 𝐬𝐻𝐾𝐭, who came from the FDA as a deputy division director. So he'd actually approved a lot of the drugs that I did deals with, funnily enough. And he was basically running clinical trials in AstraZeneca. And so we did quite a few deals together. So I was doing some combination deals with durvalumab, so AZ's PD-L1 inhibitor, and his team were the ones that would run the studies for those trials. And actually, that was kind of how the idea for Pi Health came to be, in that he was asking the questions coming from the FDA, going, why do trials cost so much money? Why are they so inefficient? Why do they take so much time? And he pitched the idea to the CEO of 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐻, a guy called John Oyler, who's very, very entrepreneurial. So he's built 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐻 from a startup to like a $30-40 billion business now, right? And he pitched the idea to say, look, I want to try and solve these inefficiencies in clinical trials and make the system more efficient and develop software to do that. Would you help? And he was like, yep, great idea. So he basically, when I was going into biotech, he went into 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐻, and we kind of kept in touch. And he basically was like telling me about what was happening with Pi Health and how the software they were developing was really kind of, going to change the industry. And I did my diligence, and he was basically like, come work with me again. And I did my diligence and I realized actually what Pi Health is doing can really transform the industry and disrupt the industry from a clinical trials perspective. And throughout my career, what I've tried to do is to really move the needle and do things that are quite innovative and changing standard of care, trying to find new oncology drugs. And then this kind of felt like a natural progression because looking at it from an outsider's perspective, the industry is pretty broken in terms of how many pieces of software are used to run trials. We obviously can go into that in more detail afterwards. But what we're trying to solve and what Jeff was trying to solve is those inefficiencies in trials. So I joined nearly 5 years ago in 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐻, which is where Pi Health was incubated. And then Pi Health formally spun out of 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐻 about 1.5 years ago as an independent venture capital-backed company. And what we've evolved to now is basically a tech-enabled CRO with the software that we had developed, basically using that and leveraging that with pharma and biotech sponsors to run clinical trials more efficiently using our CRO capabilities and the software as well.
It's really interesting that the founders had come from the FDA and obviously had that kind of real unique window into what it takes to pass drugs. And for people who are listening here, the average time, what is potentially up to 10 years, isn't it?
Very
And
much so, yeah.
in terms of the amount of money, what are we talking on average to bring a drug to market?
Yeah,
in
hundreds
tens
of
of
millions, sometimes a billion, right?
yeah.
There's a lot of, obviously that kind of figure takes into account all of the drugs that don't reach the market. So when you're developing a drug, maybe 1 in 20 kind of work, or I think the stats are probably even worse now, right? So the challenge is you've got to have multiple shots on goal with different drugs, different modalities, but actually a lot of the inefficiencies around the clinical trial process, right? So trials take, it costs a lot of money, but the bulk of that is in the trials. So running phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies, right? And there's so much inefficiency in that process, and which is again what we're trying to solve, right? Because, and the trials get more expensive year on year, and they take a lot of time. But also, everyone's trying to go to the same big academic centers to do clinical trials. So we've actually quite deliberately partnered with a lot of community sites around the world. And we can go into that in more detail in terms of who we partner with, why we partner with, and things like that. But there are so many pieces of the puzzle that are quite broken, and we spent 5 or 6 years just trying to solve that, not only from a software perspective initially, but now from who we partner with from a clinical trial site perspective. We've actually built our own cancer hospital in India, which I'll tell you more about later, which is really cool. And also the sponsors and the biotechs and the pharma that we work with as well, with the trials that we kind of run for them.
Yeah, it's super interesting that you've been very intentional with the decisions. And I'm really keen for high level, obviously, for people listening here, how does Pi Health product work, and how is it changing the way that trials are run compared to the typical and more traditional CRO route?
Yeah. So very much the software that we have, which we call Fix. So it stands for front-end interoperable capture software, but Fix is kind of like fixing the system, right? That really is a secret sauce for everything that we do, right? So at a top level, when a pharma company or biotech company, we call them sponsors, right? When they run a clinical trial, on average, they use about 5 or 6 pieces of software to do a trial. So there are things like there's a health record, there's things like called electronic data capture, clinical trial management system, trial master files, investigator side files, all this kind of word jargon, but they're each separate pieces of software that that have to be used for a trial. Trouble is each of those pieces of software, they're quite siloed. They don't really communicate with each other very well. So what ends up actually happening is that when a pharma or biotech company is running a trial, they're putting in clinical trial data, but they have to put it in multiple systems and then spend all this time, effort, and resource sending people to the clinical trial sites, which is where the patients get dosed for the trials, and just curating that data. So checking the data to make sure it's accurate. Often this data is stored in a paper format at the clinical trial sites. So really, it's super inefficient, right?
Mm.
But the system has evolved to be like that because each of these companies make quite a lot of money from each piece of the pie. So there's no incentivization to actually make it more efficient. The problem is, as an end user, right? So we used to be end users, right? So we were like AstraZeneca and BeiGene running these studies going, this is ridiculous because it's so inefficient. But, this is kind of actually why we formed Pi Health and developed the software, because we wanted to solve that. So what the software, very quickly, what the software we've done, it replaces all of those 5 or 6 pieces of software normally used in a trial with a new piece of software. I call it, bespoke, designed from the ground up, right? So it's a completely new architecture. It was done from scratch, not building on anything existing. We actually started out trying to see if we could just do an overlay layer on an existing piece of software. What we realized, I think very quickly, was it's just not going to work like that. So you have to design something from the ground up. So it basically replaces everything you use for a clinical trial, but because it's one piece of fully integrated software, so it's like a new software platform, you only put the data in once. So single data entry. So you put it in the correct a case report form, CRF format straight away, and then that's it, right? So instead of having to spend all this time and effort and resource and cost and sending people all around to check the data, because it's put in correctly in the same format, in the correct format, that's it, right? And so it makes everything more efficient. So and because it's a single piece of software, we've done things like, we've integrated everything. So things like, so for example, like the data that this trial site does, they put into Fix. That's normally stored in what's called an investigator site file, right? And then what needs to happen is that needs to be uploaded to the sponsor's trial master file, which is where they store the trial data. But we have all that within Fix, right? So you can upload that data seamlessly to the sponsor's TMF. So there are all these little things where we've just saved time, things that are digitized, there's like audit trails, all that kind of stuff. So what we're trying to do is really improve the experience for the site, like where the trials are done, and also for the sponsor. And there's also like a version for the site and a version for the sponsor, which is kind of fully integrated. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. So I think top level, it's kind of replacing all of these siloed pieces of software with a new piece of software designed from the ground up. And you get all these efficiency savings from that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, I think where we're seeing AI or any kind of, cutting edge SaaS product in this space is really to drive efficiencies, isn't it? And
Yeah,
remove
very much so.
bottlenecks, free people up, researchers, academic medical centers, the staff there to focus on the task in hand. But how important has AI been to the solution? And I know AI is kind of such a broad term that, people forget machine learning has been around for years, but in terms of latest versions of AI and large language models, how important is AI to the solution?
So it's super, very simply, super important, right? It's the future. So the challenge is, I think, has always been that data entry just generally is very, very difficult to do, right? And very tedious. And obviously, historically, it used to be done on paper, and then people are now just putting stuff and putting data into software packages that really aren't designed for it. So I think the big efficiencies you can get are around trying to make that data input process more seamless for the research nurses and the staff at the clinical trial sites to put the data in, right? I think AI is going to make, AI has or is going to, and is where we're doing a lot of stuff on that front, actually going to make a huge difference in that process. So what we're trying to do, actually, the ambition for Pi Health is really to be like the first AI native CRO. And it's been, the beauty of Fix is because we've developed it very recently and we're obviously always iterating, because we're changing how the trial is done, the groundwork is already there. And then you add AI, not on top of that, but it's kind of fully integrated into what we're doing. And then it makes everything even more efficient. So we've tried to solve already a lot of those inefficiencies with the fixed software we've developed. Now it's about actually using AI to make that even more smoother and reducing a lot of that kind of administrative burden that sites, especially and sponsors, have with data entry and data curation, data checking, things like that.
Yeah.
When they run a trial.
And you said earlier you've been quite intentional with some of your decisions and positioning of sponsors and partners. So talk about that. What for Pi, what makes a good sponsor or the right partner for you guys?
Yeah. So where it's interesting in that we are, I guess we're end users that designed, that were frustrated with the system and then designed a product to solve it. And then so Pi Health has gone through a couple of iterations, which is what happens in any startup, actually, right? So initially we were developing the software, and then we realized very quickly, actually, there's a huge unmet need, both from a pharma and a biotech perspective, for people to run, for us to run trials more efficiently as a CRO, right? So the model has evolved from just, you're not simply partnering with pharma companies or biotech companies or clinical trial sites, but it's actually also, running trials for them as a CRO. So to kind of answer your question around the types of partners we want, we believe we're pretty innovative in what we do, and we, as end users, we were very motivated to try and solve that problem. So very early on, we decided to do two things, right? The first was to really focus on partnering with the sites around the world, the clinical trial sites, where the trials get done, right? And it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario. So there's a new kind of startup. When you go to pharma and biotech saying, hey, we're going to, let's run a study for you, the first question is, well, who are you working with? Right. So it's a chicken and egg scenario where you want to be, so you need to be working with clinical trial sites around the world, or as many sites as you can, to give pharma and biotech the confidence you're running studies, and the sites, which are the end users as well, like what we're doing. So we were actually quite picky in terms of who we partner with. So, if I take Australia as an example, so in addition to like heading up business development, I'm also like the general manager for Australia and Europe. And we have in Australia about 5 sites we've partnered with. And we kind of choose to work with really entrepreneurial, innovative individuals who are either very experienced in trials or sometimes haven't done trials, but they're super smart and want to do trials, right? So the people we've kind of partnered with from a site perspective in Australia, for example, they're very experienced late career clinicians who've been there, done that, but they kind of got very quickly the problem we were trying to solve. And, we spoke to lots of people, right? So, but we were very selective in who we partnered with, because we wanted to work with like-minded people that were very motivated to try and solve the inefficiencies in trials and work with us at the ground level to try and do that, right? So we're very lucky in that the Aussie sites we partner with, they're very experienced, but they're also, the community-based sites as well. So another issue that often happens with clinical trials is that, everyone's kind of going to the same big academic centers. So all the pharma and biotech are trying to find the same pool of patients, but actually the majority of patients get treated in the community setting.
Okay.
So what we try to do deliberately actually is partner with all these community-based sites around the world. So I mentioned Australia, but in Brazil, we have a lot of community sites we partner with, some of which have never done trials before. And then also in America, we have a site we've partnered with in New Jersey. They've been around for 40 years, just treating patients in oncology, but they never on a trial. Never run a trial before partnering with Pi Health.
Yeah.
And then we work with them to basically make them trial ready. And now they're running like global phase 3 studies for pharma. So it's really cool. So
Yeah.
we're trying to solve those kinds of problems, but as I said, we're very selective who we work with from a site perspective. And the other thing I should also mention, we actually built our own hospital in India, in
Yeah, you
Hyderabad. So we have
mentioned.
our
How
own,
did that
yeah,
come
it's
about?
kind of cool. So we have, basically what we realized was India it's a major area, a major population base, but historically they've had extremely poor access to clinical trials. So drugs get approved, but maybe the main studies that are done there are kind of phase 4 studies. So after, post-marketing studies, but there are all these patients that want to go on trials, but they don't have access to trials. But historically, there's been this concern around data quality, which is what Fix is trying to solve, but also infrastructure. So this is why we actually built our own cancer hospital in Hyderabad, where Fix is kind of fully vertically integrated. So the moment a patient gets seen, the data gets put into Fix, and then you can find patients very quickly for trials. So we ran a phase 2 study for a pharma company where we really smashed like the milestones in terms of how quickly we could find patients, recruit them, and close a study. And now that's been used to support regulatory approval for that drug in India, which is quite cool. And we're running, I think, 7 phase 3s now for global pharma in the Indian sites that we have partnered with, and now including our own cancer hospital. So it's kind of trying to address that unmet need kind of wherever we go, because in addition to trying to make trials more efficient, what we're trying to do is really kind of what I call democratize access to clinical trial patients. So
Yeah.
really targeting those sites where most patients get treated, but historically don't have access to trials. The other thing you mentioned earlier around in terms of who we choose to partner with. So it's, the sites are just kind of one part of it, right? So obviously, if you look at the ecosystem, obviously the sites are where the trials kind of get run. So you have the clinicians that will basically, find the patients and then dose the patients with a study drug. But obviously the people that are, responsible for the studies are the pharma and biotech companies as well. So we obviously have to partner with those guys too. So again, we're quite selective in who we work with. So as you can probably imagine, we're working with your BeiGene, that BeOne Medicines, because we span out of them, but we are running quite a few other studies for biotech and pharma. We actually announced last Thursday a biotech partnership in Australia with a company called Philemon. That was in Fierce Biotech, was featured in Fierce last Thursday. And this is basically where we're using Fix, and we're running a phase 1 study in 3 sites in Australia, using Fix. So the sponsor is using Fix, and then the sites are using Fix as well, which is quite cool. And that's kind of the first kind of, one we've gone in the public domain other than the B1 stuff. But very soon we're going to announce a big pharma partnership with a global top 10 pharma company. I unfortunately can't say more because we have to, still under wraps.
No,
But
no.
that's going to really be quite cool for us, actually, because it's an important validation of, the way we can partner with both pharma as, biotech, as well as pharma as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff coming, and obviously, I'd say watch this space.
Exciting, real exciting times. And you mentioned something earlier about it's really important about kind of data quality, and obviously that ties into governance. And there's a lot of concerns at the moment for healthcare generally, but if you look at research and clinical research, when you mention AI, there is still that nervousness around governance and hallucinations and just data quality. In your experience, obviously at Pi and obviously previously to this, why do you think it's so important that kind of regulatory grade data is available in real time? And how does Pi ensure, not so much guarantee, but ensure that there's the right guardrails in place around data governance and AI governance?
Yeah. It's a very good question. And I think, data quality is extremely important, right? It's the cornerstone of the industry, and it needs to, there's a lot of regulation, and rightly so. I think the key thing for us is that, a lot of the team, like a lot of the leadership team and the engineering team and, people, they're ex-FDA, right?
Okay.
So in terms of, who better to kind of run and develop software than ex-regulatory officials, right? So we have a very, very strong team that's kind of a lot of ex-FDA people, ex-regulatory people, big pharma, so 𝐟𝐨𝐫𝐿𝐵𝐰ene, BeiGene/BeOne, also ex-CRO people as well. So that's really helped in terms of how we've developed Fix, right? So at the outset, it's all been about data quality, and as you say, getting regulatory quality data from the start. So the way we kind of capture data is quite unique in that it's a case report format structure which is what's used for trials, right? So we've gotten a lot of the basics done correctly. And then if you put the data in correctly in a regulatory grade format, then as I said, that has huge benefits later down the line. Because a lot of the issues that, pharma and biotech, especially biotech really, when they run studies, is that's the data quality, data integrity. And that's kind of when you put the data into different pieces of software, then sometimes the quality gets lost. You've got to check it to make sure it's correct. And we've solved a lot of those problems, right? So there's that to start off with. And then to answer your question about AI, right? AI. So again, it's obviously needs to be very highly regulated. So if you get the basics right in terms of how you put the data in, then you can kind of incorporate AI in a certain way that is adding to the process, but obviously it doesn't sacrifice that data quality, because if you do that, then obviously then you have major problems kind of down the line, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because a lot of people we interview, unfortunately, have to speak to a lot of health tech leaders, and the one thing that always comes to the back of it is, I think we're a little way from frontline care with AI, but I think from research, you're talking yourself, the workflow efficiencies, the speed to market, the cost savings, but there's still that nervousness. I'm giving you lots of very personal data here, and
Very
what
much
are you
so,
going to do with it? I know you can't say, obviously, company names. You alluded to some really exciting announcements that will be due soon. But in terms of, if you look broadly speaking from clinical research, what do you think is the next big opportunity in play for you guys in terms of whether it's a product development piece or whether it's just a wider opportunity for you?
Sure. So I guess, from a product development piece, it's really about integrating AI more fully into Fix, right? So that's really the focus from an engineering product development perspective. So we've got the groundwork that's extremely solid, and we're very fortunate because the software has just been recently developed and it's obviously always iterating. So we can now kind of build on that and fully incorporate kind of AI as much as we can into Fix, right? So that's what we're focusing on from a product development point of view. Just from an industry perspective, I think we're in a good position actually, because pharma and you always have to do clinical trials, right? No matter what happens globally in the economy and everything, we need medicines for patients, right? So there's always going to be people, pharma and biotech developing new drugs and having to test them in clinical trials, right? So, but because everything is getting more expensive and more inefficient, and also with funding environments and things like that, there's a huge pressure to actually do more with what you have, right? In terms of the funding that you have, if you're a biotech, or if a pharma, you want to be more efficient, right? And this is obviously where we can really kind of plug that gap and niche, because that's kind of why we were formed, right? We were formed as end users to try and solve this problem. So the real opportunity for us, I think, is it's kind of building on what we've done to date, but really partnering a lot more with other pharma companies, running more trials, running trials for them, and then more with the ones we're partnered with and we will partner with. And then from a biotech perspective, it's really addressing that kind of unmet need from a tech-enabled CRO perspective, where, every biotech needs is different, right? So not every biotech is going to be able to run a study end to end, or even, or they can't afford to work with the big CROs.
Yeah.
There's a gap there to have with us powered by Fix. So really running efficient studies at a reasonable cost, but to a pharma standard, right? And then also providing additional services, because we have ex regulatory people, we have ex pharma development people. So it's kind of, for the biotechs, it's really not just like your typical CRO service, but it's like you've got the software, which is really efficient, but it's also the people that we have in the team. And then trying to plug those gaps with the biotech to basically help them run pharma standard studies at a biotech kind of cost, right? And so there's quite a few opportunities for us. And then more broadly, we're very much focused on oncology at the moment, but we're going to go into other therapy areas as well. I mean, we always say oncology has been the toughest way to to develop, because it's very kind of specific in terms of how you measure endpoints and all that kind of stuff. But now that we've done a lot of the heavy lifting there, we do want to kind of move into other therapy areas. But there's a lot of opportunity. I think the industry needs trials to be run more efficiently. There's a big racing competition with the farmers and the biotechs to get data quickly, but at a very high quality. And that's kind of where we think we have this little niche there.
Well, it's no surprise you've had the successes and you've got some announcements on the horizon where it's speaking to you very clear, very such clarity with kind of what you're doing and intentional, which I think a lot of early stage companies sometimes they lack. They kind of follow the trend, but actually for you, you're very specific and intentional with those decisions. And yeah, it's been really good to have you on. I'm sure people listening here can check Pi out. I know clinical research for a lot of people, they access the pharmacy, they get the drugs, and sometimes most people don't actually think, well, how do they get here? And actually what they forget is the tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, the 10 years of work behind that. And what you guys are doing is just hopefully will reduce that time to market, but also will reduce costs ultimately, which I think's which everyone benefits from.
And also increase access of patients to medicines, right?
100%.
So it's kind of, it's about making everything more efficient, and then you get those cost savings, those efficiency savings, the time savings. So hopefully, drugs can get to market quicker, but it's also really trying to increase access of patients to medicines, right? A big issue is around, everyone's kind of going to the same sites, and then, the people that talk about, community-based sites, but because we partnered a lot with those community-based sites and Fix is kind of helping them to punch above their weight, to do trials and stuff, we hope that we can kind of address that little aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I've got every confidence you will. And Ro, thanks so much for coming on this afternoon. It's been really interesting and a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Take care.